What's going on, everybody? Kalipas Tech here, coming back at you with another video. This is pros and cons for the Cricut Vision Plus. In this video, I'm going to be giving you some of my favorite and least favorite things about this phone to help you decide whether or not it's the right one for you. Now, before we go any further, I do want to remind you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And if you want to learn more about this phone, be sure to check out my full review and tips and tricks videos for it on the channel. But with that being said, let's get started. So my first pro for the Cricut Vision Plus is the software. Now this phone, surprisingly given its price range, does have Android 12, and while a phone under $100 having the latest version of Android is not unheard of by any means, there are plenty of phones in this price range that only have Android 11, and seeing that an entry-level phone, especially a Cricut branded one, is probably not going to get any major updates, it is nice to see that when we get it, it at least does come with the latest version of Android. Now that being said, of course, Android 13 is right around the corner, so if you do want the latest versions of Android as they come out, this is probably still not going to be the phone for you. But if you are in the market for a more entry-level device and you still want at least the newest software you can get, then this phone, seeing that it does actually have Android 12, will be a pretty good choice. Now my second pro for the Cricut Vision Plus is the large display. Now when I say this phone has a large display, of course, this is relatively speaking, because it's nowhere near the size of something like a Samsung Galaxy S22 Ultra or a Moto G stylus or anything like that. But considering that lots of phones in this price range have really small displays, the Cricut Vision Plus is really not bad. So with this phone, we're getting a 6-inch IPS LCD display with a resolution of 720p, a PPI of 270, and an aspect ratio of 20:9. So again, while it's not the biggest display out there, for what it is, I do think it's pretty good, and with this phone, you still will have the benefits of having a decently large display. So when you're consuming content and stuff like that, maybe streaming videos or playing a game, or even just going on social media, you will get a decent experience here. And at the same time, this phone also does have a decently slim design, so it's not going to be too bulky either. And in addition to the size itself, this phone also does have pretty good dimensions. With an aspect ratio of 20:9, we're getting a pretty tall and narrow form factor. So when you're doing something like streaming a video or playing a game in landscape mode, for example, you're going to get a much more immersive experience. Things are going to look more cinematic, and overall, it's going to be much better than a shorter and wider form factor. In addition to this, if you're doing something like reading, browsing the web, or even just scrolling through a social media feed, you'll be able to fit more content on the screen without having to scroll as much. So overall, while this isn't the largest or highest quality display out there, for an entry-level phone under $100, I would say it's still pretty decent. Now my third pro for the Cricut Vision Plus is the Face Unlock. So with this phone, unfortunately, we don't get a fingerprint scanner, but we do at least have Face Unlock, so we do get one other option besides a pin to get into the phone. Now on one hand, I do personally feel like today in 2022, any phone should have a fingerprint scanner, but unfortunately, when it comes to these really entry-level phones, not all of them, but a pretty good number of them have neither a fingerprint scanner nor Face Unlock, so you're stuck putting in a pin or a password or whatever you choose as your main screen lock. Now for some people, this might not necessarily be a bad thing, because plenty of people, especially people who are looking for a more low-end phone like this, might prefer to do things the old-fashioned way. But at the same time, fingerprint scanners and Face Unlock are definitely nice, convenient features to have. And even though we're not getting a fingerprint scanner here, again, it is a nice thing that we at least get Face Unlock. My fourth pro for the Cricut Vision Plus is the headphone jack. So with this phone, we actually do get a 3.5mm headphone jack right up top, and this is definitely a nice feature to have. Now you might be thinking, pretty much every phone nowadays has a headphone jack, but in this day and age, with more and more manufacturers doing away with their headphone jacks, even in lower end phones, this is actually not really the case anymore. Sure, the vast majority of really low-end phones like this do have headphone jacks still, but seeing that, for example, Samsung got rid of the headphone jack in both the Samsung Galaxy A53 5G and the A33 5G, it's really just a matter of time before even the lower-end phones like this start to lose their headphone jacks. Now, I'm assuming a good number of people still do use wired headphones, and even if you don't, it's always nice to at least have the option to use a normal pair of headphones, or maybe not even headphones, maybe if you have an aux cord or something like that. Whatever the case may be, there are plenty of reasons where a headphone jack would definitely come in handy. So while a phone like this having a headphone jack is not uncommon by any means, in fact, pretty much all of them have it at this point, seeing the direction phones are going these days, it's definitely one of those features we should really appreciate while we still can. Now my fifth pro for the Cricut Vision Plus is the USB-C. Now this phone does in fact have a USB-C port right here for charging and data transfer, and the reason this is such a nice thing is that so many phones in this price range only have micro USB, and not only is USB-C quite a bit better, but it's also compatible with more accessories as well. Now I'm not really sure why a bunch of lower end phones have micro USB, especially in the US where USB-C has been standard for quite a while now, but luckily with the Cricut Vision Plus, this is not the case. But now that we've gone over some of the good things about this phone, let's talk about some drawbacks. So my first con for the Cricut Vision Plus is the camera. To give you a quick rundown of the camera setup here, we got a front-facing camera on the bezel here, and this camera is 5 megapixels. Then on the back, we got just a single camera here, and this camera is 8 megapixels. So as you can tell, there are really no extra features at all. No ultra-wide camera, no macro camera, not even a depth sensor, although I will say portrait mode does work surprisingly well. But if you're taking lots of photos and you want a wider variety of features, then this phone will be a huge letdown for you because it really doesn't have a whole lot. In addition to this, the photo quality really isn't the greatest. This right here is a photo taken with the rear camera, and I guess it's not really bad for what it is, but if you're taking a lot of photos for social media or something like that, I'm sure you can see how it could be a little disappointing because the quality is not really very impressive at all. Now obviously this is really an entry-level phone that's under $100, so you can only really expect so much, but at the same time, if you're on social media a lot, for example, then this is definitely still worth keeping in mind. But that being said, if you're a real casual camera user and you're really only taking a couple photos here and there, maybe for something like Snapchat where the quality really doesn't matter, or just to send to friends and family, then while again the features and quality definitely leave a lot to be desired, this phone will probably at least get the job done. Now my second con for the Cricut Vision Plus is the storage. With this phone, we're getting 32 gigabytes of internal storage with microSD card expansion, and in this day and age, with stuff like apps, just general data, and even the system taking up more and more space, 32 gigabytes really isn't going to cut it for any phone. Even if you're more of a casual user and you're not doing a whole lot, no matter what you're doing with this phone, stuff is going to add up pretty quickly. And while the microSD card expansion does help a little, it's still nice to have more storage on the phone itself. So unless you're a real light user, you're definitely going to have to watch what you're doing on this phone. Now to give you an idea of what this storage actually looks like, as you can see here, I'm taking up 23 gigabytes of space right now, and there's really not a whole lot left. As you can see here, the system itself is taking up 9.9, almost 10 gigabytes. So instead of 32 gigabytes of storage, since obviously we can't avoid using the system, essentially 10 gigabytes is already going to be taken up no matter what. So we really only have 22 gigabytes to use. Now I don't really have a whole lot on here. I have no photos and videos. Well, I have 2 photos, but that's pretty much nothing. And other than that, I have a couple games and then mostly just the apps that I would use on a daily basis. And again, it's taking up pretty much all of the storage on this phone. And not to mention stuff like text data, cookies from browsing the web, and all that kind of stuff. It will add up over time, and a lot of that stuff you can't even offload onto a micro SD card. So as you can see here, really having 32 gigabytes of internal storage is not going to be enough for most people. So overall, this storage really just goes to show that this phone is not meant to be used for a whole lot. If you're doing the basics like sending text messages, making calls, occasionally browsing the web and social media, and maybe playing a simple game or two, then you should be okay. But if you have a bunch of apps on here, or even just a moderate amount of apps, your storage is probably going to fill up pretty quickly. Now my third con for the Cricut Vision Plus is the processor. With this phone, we're getting 3 gigabytes of RAM with the MediaTek Helio A22 processor. So in general, in my experience using this phone, I haven't really had too many performance issues, but there are some times when it's just really slow. Even when you're just navigating through the phone itself, sometimes it does lag a little. And when you're on social media or playing a game or something like that, most of the time, depending on what you're doing, it will work at least decently, but you definitely won't get the best experience. And if you're really on your phone a lot, you're definitely going to notice the processor just isn't very fast. Now I did run a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on this phone, and it came back with a single core score of 163 and a multi-core score of 548. Now by itself, these numbers might not mean a whole lot to you, so what I recommend doing is running this test on your current phone and comparing your score to this to see whether or not this phone would be an upgrade for you. But I can pretty much tell you off the top of my head, just having run this test on so many other phones, this is probably not going to be an upgrade for most people. In fact, even among entry-level phones, there really aren't very many phones that are slower than this. So unless you're really just doing super basic activities, like sending text messages, making calls, and some really light web browsing and social media use, then you're probably going to want to go for a slightly higher end device that has a faster processor. And I will say, even if you don't want to spend a whole lot of money on a phone, there are phones out there that are much faster than this that actually aren't really that much more expensive. In fact, depending on whether or not you get this phone at full price, you could potentially even get a faster phone for free. And if you do want to know what's going on as far as deals go, be sure to check out the link in the video description because this does change all the time. But the bottom line is, if you're using your phone heavily, or even moderately for that matter, and you want to do anything besides the basics, you should probably consider a device that has a better processor. Now my fourth con for the Cricut Vision Plus is the battery. Now with this phone, we're getting a 3500 milliamp hour battery, which really isn't very big. Now on one hand, this is not the worst out there. There are plenty of other phones that have smaller batteries, but at the same time, for a really entry-level entry-level device that doesn't really have very many impressive features. I was hoping they would at least give it a decently large battery, but unfortunately at 3500 mAh, sure, it'll probably at least last throughout the day if you're not using it too heavily. But the other factor to consider is that down the road, as the battery degrades, the capacity is going to get smaller and smaller, and with a battery like this that's barely going to last a day, you're going to notice this effect a lot sooner than you might with other phones. So if you like to get one phone and keep it for a longer period of time without having to replace it, then this phone might not be the best choice for you. But that being said, one feature about this phone that's a little unique is that the battery is actually removable. So in terms of longevity, this does sort of even things out, because when your battery wears out, if the rest of the phone is working at least, you can just replace the battery instead of replacing the whole phone. But in general, despite this, again, the battery really isn't that great with this phone. So if battery life and longevity is a priority for you, then you're probably going to want to consider a different device. Now, my fifth and final con for the Cricket Vision Plus is the materials. Now, it kind of goes without saying that this phone is made entirely of plastic, except of course for the display, which is glass. But at the same time, this plastic is really cheap and it feels really cheap as well. In fact, the design in general is pretty flimsy. Sure, it doesn't look very bad, but it doesn't feel sturdy or high quality at all. And the phone itself has hardly any weight to it, so it really does feel cheap. Now, this might not bother everyone. In fact, a lot of people might not even care at all whether or not it feels premium, but I personally like to have a phone that at least feels of decent quality, and unfortunately, that is not this phone. But those were my pros and cons for the Cricket Vision Plus. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you found this information useful as well. If you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. And again, if you want to learn more about this phone, be sure to check out my full review and tips and tricks videos for it as well, where I go more in depth about its specs and features. But that's it for this video. As always, I will see you in the next one.